I'll tell you how it started, since people in Flat Creek have made up their own version and got most of it wrong. It started with rain, and a boy who didn't have the sense to leave well enough alone, and a woman standing on the depot platform with one trunk and nowhere particular to go. That's the whole of the beginning. The rest of it took longer, and it was better for taking longer, though I didn't see that at the time. My name is Rafe Dolan. I run horses on 40 acres east of the Flat Creek Depot, quarter horses mostly. A few good-boned mares I keep for breeding. It's a sound operation now, though it wasn't always. There were years in my 20s when sound was the last word anyone would have used for the way I lived, and I'm not going to lie about that. I ran hard along the margins of things. Some of what I did in those years, I'm not proud of, and some of it I'd do again without apology, because it kept my brother and sister fed when nothing else would. That's the kind of accounting a man makes when he's the only one left standing between two small children and a cold winter. And I made it, and I'll stand by it. My mother died of fever the winter I turned 19. Nettie was 6, Davy was 4. There was no one else. My father had been gone since I was 12, rode west one morning, and sent back a letter from Utah, then nothing. So it was me. I did what I had to do. I won't give you the full inventory of those years. It's enough to say I kept them fed and housed and warm, and that it cost me things I've mostly made my peace with, and that by the time I was 26, I'd put enough together, through enough work of varying legality, to buy the 40 acres outside Flat Creek. I set about making something honest out of what I'd built dishonestly, and I did. The horses were good. The land was mine, clean and squared. By the time I was 35, the ranch was paying for itself. Nettie had married a decent grain farmer named Cobb, out of Millhaven, and was expecting her first child, and Davy was 14, and growing fast, and still half wild, which I considered appropriate at 14. I had not been wild myself at 14, I'd been too busy, but I thought he deserved the chance to be, within the bounds of what I could keep from going sideways. I tell you all of this so you understand what I was before Vera Halstead arrived. I was a contained man. A man who had long since organized his life around what needed doing, who didn't spend much time looking at the horizon and wondering. I had my horses. I had Davy. I had the work. I went to town on Thursdays for supplies and came back. I ate what I cooked and slept when I was tired, and was up before light, and did it again. I was not lonely, or I had talked myself out of knowing I was, which comes to the same thing eventually. I was good at convincing myself of things. It's a useful skill, right up until it isn't. Vera arrived on the Thursday stage the last week of October. I wasn't there to see it. I was at the feed merchant, but Davy was. He'd ridden in with me that morning, and I'd told him to meet me at the wagon by noon, and instead, he was at the depot platform in the rain, watching the stage pull in, because at 14, Davy went wherever the day pointed him, and noon was more of a suggestion than a plan. He had a habit of being exactly where things happened, which I'd come to accept was less about luck than about some instinct he'd been born with for finding the live wire in a situation. He told me about it that evening over supper. He described her in the way a 14-year-old describes things, a torrent of detail about the rain and the mud and the color of her trunk, which was dark brown with brass fittings, and what the station master had said, and how a couple of the cattle buyers at the far end of the platform had looked at her, the way Davy did not like, and he'd moved himself between them and her, which I noted without comment. He did not describe Vera herself in much detail, except to say she was standing under the narrow depot overhang, alone with her hands folded on top of her canvas bag, and the station master had told her there wasn't a room to let in Flat Creek that week because of the fall cattle buyers, and she'd said, very quietly, that she understood, and she'd stood there in the dripping overhang, and Davy said she looked like a person who was calculating what to do next, and was taking her time about it. He said her name was Miss Halstead, and she'd come to take the schoolteacher post. I told him I'd heard the post had been filled. He nodded. He'd apparently stood there long enough to hear that too. The county supervisor had given the post to a man from Abilene, a political arrangement Davy did not fully understand, and I understood perfectly, and the letter informing Miss Halstead of this had been sent to her last address in a town called Copper Wells, but she'd already left Copper Wells by the time the letter arrived, and so she'd ridden 3 days on the stage to a post that no longer existed, and here she was, in the rain, with a trunk and no place to sleep. I said that was a hard situation. Davy agreed. He ate for a moment. The fire was going and the rain was at the window, and I could hear one of the mares moving in the barn, restless from the cold. Then Davy said, very casually, that he'd invited her to stay. I put down my fork. He looked at the table. I said, "You did what?" He said he'd invited her to stay at the ranch. He'd told her we had a spare room, Nettie's old room, and she was welcome to it while she sorted things out. He'd said it before he'd thought it through. He admitted that, and he could see from my face that he'd overstepped. But she'd looked at that platform in the rain, and he'd looked at her, and it had seemed like the right thing to say. I sat with that for a long moment. The fire cracked. Davy was very still, the way he got when he was prepared for something, but not backing down from it. The right thing to say, I told him, was not necessarily his to say on my behalf. He met my eyes then. He was 14 and already nearly as tall as me, all elbows and a jaw that hadn't caught up to the rest of his face yet, and he had our mother's eyes, brown and direct and not afraid of much. He said, "I know, but I already said it, and she said she'd come out in the morning if you didn't mind." I minded. I minded it considerably. I had not agreed to take in a stranger, a woman I'd never met, whose situation was not my doing, and not my problem. The spare room was storage. I ran a horse ranch, not a hotel. Davy had overstepped and he knew it, and he was looking at me with those eyes that were too much like our mother's for me to hold out against for very long. I said, "She'll need to pull her weight while she's here." Davy smiled, which meant he'd known I was going to say yes before I'd known it myself. She arrived the next morning in the borrowed buckboard of a man named Pruitt, who ran the feed supplier, and was apparently the sort to do a good turn without being asked. She had her trunk, and a canvas bag, and a no-nonsense way of stepping down from a wagon that suggested she'd done it plenty of times and didn't need help. I was at the fence with a gray gelding when she came through the gate, and I watched her take in the yard, the barn, the lean-to, the house, the horses in the near paddock, and she didn't look disappointed or relieved, just observant, the way a practical person takes in a new set of facts and files them without drama. She was 30, or near it, plain-faced in the way that means the face holds up, nothing sharp or delicate that the frontier sun will ruin, nothing that depended on youth to work. Her hair was brown and pinned back without ceremony. She wore a dark coat that was good quality, but had seen some use, and she carried herself like a woman who knew her own weight in the world, which was, I noticed it. I will not pretend I didn't notice it. Davy brought her over and introduced us. She shook my hand without making a production of it, and thanked me for the room. I said it was Davy's offer, not mine, which was the truth, and also, I realized the moment I said it, a rude thing to say to someone I'd just met in a difficult situation. She looked at me with an expression that suggested she'd dealt with ruder, and said she understood entirely, and would try not to be underfoot. I said that would be appreciated. That was the beginning of our acquaintance. I was not proud of it. She went inside with Davy. I went back to the gelding. I told myself I'd done what I could with the situation, and it would resolve itself in a week. It did not resolve itself in a week. By Monday, she had organized the kitchen in a way that made considerably more sense than it had before. The staples where you could reach them, the pots where the weight didn't throw off the shelf, and fixed the hinge on the back door that had been wrong for 6 months, and that I kept meaning to get to. And she had started teaching Davy his letters in the evenings, which was something I'd been trying to do myself, with limited patience and even more limited success. She had a way of coming at a thing from the angle that made the most sense for the particular person she was teaching, and Davy was already making progress that I found frankly embarrassing, given how little I'd managed with the same material. She wasn't doing it to prove something. She was doing it because it was the task in front of her, and she was not the sort to leave a task alone. I did not talk to her much those first days. I was out with the horses early and late, and when I came in for supper, she had it ready, and we ate, and Davy talked enough for 3 people, and she listened to him, the way a good listener does, fully, without looking over his shoulder for someone more interesting. And I watched that, and kept my mouth full, so I didn't have to account for anything. A man who talks with his mouth full is harder to ask questions of. By the end of the first week, I knew she wasn't going anywhere quickly. By the end of the second, I'd stopped wanting her to, and I hadn't yet made peace with what that meant. She was looking for a new post. She wrote letters in the evenings. I saw her at the kitchen table, the lamp close, her handwriting small and even, addressed to county school boards and district supervisors. She'd had 6 years of teaching, she told Davy, in 3 different county schools, and she was not worried about finding another position, only about timing. She said it the way people say things they're trying to believe. I didn't comment on that, but I listened. One Thursday when I went to town, I stopped in at the county supervisor's office. Falk was a soft man, soft around the middle, and careful about whom he offended, which meant he was essentially a weather vane, and went wherever the strongest wind was blowing from. I told him the school post had been given to a man from Abilene, and asked if there was a second position available, since the district was growing, and one teacher for the whole county school was thin coverage. He said there wasn't funding. I said it seemed a shame. I looked at him for long enough that he became visibly uncomfortable, and then I thanked him and left. I didn't tell Vera I'd done that. It wasn't my place. It was just a thing I'd checked on, and I wanted to know the lay of the land. She'd been with us 3 weeks when Garrett Pruill came out on a Saturday morning. Pruill ran cattle on the South Range and fancied himself the primary opinion in Flat Creek, which he was, in the way that the loudest voice in a room counts as an opinion, regardless of whether it's earned one. He came out, uninvited, which was his habit, to look at the gray gelding, and he found Vera in the yard splitting kindling, which she did every Saturday morning, because the woodpile was low when she arrived, and she'd taken it upon herself to keep it stocked without being asked. Pruill watched her from his horse, and said something about the widow woman living at Dolan's place. She set down the axe. She looked up at him. She said, "I'm not a widow. I'm a schoolteacher between positions, and a guest of the Dolan family, and I'd appreciate being referred to by my name, which is Miss Halstead." Pruill looked at me. I was at the near paddock gate, had been since he rode in. I looked back at him. He laughed, the way men laugh when they've been corrected and don't want to show it cost them anything. He said something about not knowing I was running a boarding house now. I said, "I'm running a horse ranch, and what happens in my house is my business. The gray gelding is $22 if you want him." Pruill bought the gelding, eventually, though he took his time about it in the way men take their time when they want to make clear they're not being pushed. But he left, and the yard was quiet again, and Vera picked up the axe and went back to the kindling without a word. That evening I heard from Davy that she'd been in town that afternoon while I was at the feed merchant. She'd gone on an errand of her own, and she'd heard her name in the way you hear your name when people don't know you're there, in Pruill's construction, repeated and embroidered. She'd come home, made supper, set it on the table, said it was a fine evening and she was tired, and gone to her room. I sat with that after Davy told me. I sat with it a good while. The next morning she was up before I was, which was unusual, and when I came into the kitchen she was standing at the window with a cup of coffee, and her back was straight and her jaw was set, and she had the look of a person who has worked something out in the dark and arrived at a decision. I poured my coffee and stood beside her at the window and looked out at the horses in the frost. After a while I said, "Town's not always fair about women who live outside the arrangements they've decided on for everyone." She said she was aware of that. I said, "It doesn't make those women wrong, it makes the town small." She was quiet. The frost was thick on the paddock fence, and the horses were moving slow in it, their breath coming white. Then she said, "I've been thinking I should move on. Find a position in the next county. There's no use staying where there's no work." I said, "There might be work." She looked at me. I said, "Falk had a habit of revisiting decisions when someone put a better case to him than the first one." I said I knew 3 ranchers in this district whose children had been home from school since September, and that was waste of children, and I'd said so plainly to all 3, and that if enough of us pressed the point, Falk would find the funding faster than he thought he could. She was looking at me steadily. Her coffee was in both hands, and I realized I had said considerably more than I meant to, considerably faster than was characteristic of me, and that I'd done it because the thought of her leaving for the next county was one I didn't want to sit with. She said, "You've been talking to the ranchers?" I said I'd mentioned the school situation in passing. She said, "And Falk?" I said I'd been in his office. She was quiet. Then she said, carefully. Mr. Dolan, I want to be clear about something. I am not in the habit of needing someone to manage my circumstances for me. I've been handling my circumstances since I was 22, and I intend to keep doing it. I said, I know that. She said, but I appreciate that you mentioned it. I said, Davy made a case for you too, for what it's worth. She smiled then, small and warm, the kind that starts at one corner and takes its time, and looked back out at the horses. I looked at the horses too. We drank our coffee in the cold kitchen with the November light coming in flat and pale through the window, and neither of us said anything for a while, and it was the most comfortable I had been in the presence of another person in longer than I could honestly account for. December came in cold and stayed that way. I brought the mares into the barn, and Davy helped me set up the extra stalls without being asked, which was progress. Vera took over Davy's schooling in earnest. She'd written to Abilene for textbooks, and they'd arrived, and she had him working through arithmetic and history and reading aloud in the evenings by lamplight, and the improvement was visible enough inside 3 weeks that I stopped wincing when he read and started listening. She was good at teaching in a way I had no practice recognizing, because it didn't look like what I thought teaching looked like. She didn't lecture. She asked questions, and then she asked better questions, and she paid attention to what the wrong answers told her about how a mind was working, and came at the problem differently the next time. She found Davy interesting, genuinely, and he knew the difference between genuine interest and performed patience, because he'd had both from me over the years. Her version made him sit up straighter without her asking. I started staying at the table after supper. Not much, not talking much, but I stayed. I'd have my second coffee and she'd be at her letters or reading, and we'd talk in the way that happens when two practical people are in the same room and neither of them has energy for performance. About the horses, about the winter, about what Davy needed for spring, about the book she was reading. She had opinions, expressed without apology and without sharpening them into challenges. I found that I had opinions too, ones I hadn't articulated to anyone in long enough that I'd almost forgotten they existed. She drew them out without trying to, just by being interested, and that was, I noticed it, is what I'll say. I noticed it every time. She told me about Copper Wells one evening in December, when the snow was thick at the windows, the school there, the families she'd taught, the way the post had ended. The county had appointed a committee to review her conduct, she said, and used language like that, her conduct, and the committee was composed of men appointed by the supervisor, and the conduct in question had been teaching the older girls arithmetic beyond what was considered necessary for their futures. The committee had found this overreach. She'd been given the choice to revise her curriculum or vacate the position. She'd vacated the position, without drama, but also without revision. I held very still when she told me that. I looked at the table. I was thinking about the kind of patience that takes to have done the right thing, clearly and deliberately, in a situation rigged against you, and to have walked away from it without bitterness, carrying only the knowledge of being right and the inconvenience of having no income. I said, the man Falk put in the Flat Creek Post, does he know arithmetic? She said she had no idea. I said, I'll find out. She looked at me, that corner smile again. She said, Rafe, you don't have to fix this. I said, I know that. She said, then why do you keep trying? I looked at her. I was not a man who talked about the inside of things. I'd spent my adult life being the person who did the work, not the one who explained the reason for it. But the snow was at the windows and the lamp was between us, and she was looking at me with her direct, unhurried attention, and I said, because you're being made to work harder than the situation requires, due to other people's bad judgment, and that bothers me. She said, it bothers a lot of people. I said, the ones who are bothered aren't doing anything about it. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, that is either a very touching observation, or the most roundabout way I've ever been told someone likes me. I looked at the table. She was not wrong. I said, it might be both. She said, all right. I went to bed. I lay there in the dark and listened to the wind, and thought about what it had taken me 35 years to say 4 words that oblique, and considered that I was going to have to find a better way, or we'd be at this for the rest of winter. January was the first hard month. We had a week of driving snow that kept us close to the house and barn, and in that close time I came to know her differently. The way you know a person when there's nowhere else to be, and the work is shared, and the days are long. She was not easy in the way that some people are easy, smooth and agreeable at all surfaces. She held her own in a disagreement, and she didn't soften a thing she thought to spare my feelings. And when I said something she didn't agree with, she said so without heat and with the specific reason she didn't agree, which was more than most people bothered with. We argued once, properly, during that snowed-in week, about Davy and how much rope to give him. He'd been out past dark 2 nights running, down at the Pruitt place with the Pruitt boys, and I'd told him that was done. She said he was 14, not 4, and what he needed was the chance to make small mistakes in a safe place before he got old enough to make large ones in an unsafe one, because the large ones were coming regardless, and the only question was whether he'd had any practice. She said it with the same calm she brought to everything, and I sat with it, and I recognized that she was right, that I'd been watching my own worst-case version of myself at 14 and trying to prevent it from the outside instead of equipping him from the inside, and it cost me something to say so, but I said so. She said, "Thank you." I said, "Don't make a habit of it." She said, "Of thanking you?" I said, "Of being right." She laughed. Fully, easily, the laugh she had when something actually struck her, head tilted back slightly, not performing it. And the kitchen was warm, and the snow was at the windows, and I thought, there it is. That's the problem and the answer both at once, right there. I didn't say that. I refilled my coffee and went to check the barn, but I thought it. Davy knew before I said anything. He was 14, but he watched things the way children who've grown up in houses that depended on reading the room will watch things, and what he saw in that January kitchen was what he'd been hoping for, I think, when he'd called her in from the depot platform in the rain. He never made direct mention of it, but he started doing things, small, deliberate things. He'd find reasons to be elsewhere in the evenings, so Vera and I had the kitchen to ourselves. He'd ask her questions and then direct the answer toward me. He'd do his reading at the table with his back to us and his ears working overtime, and I knew he was listening, and I didn't stop him, because stopping him would have required naming the thing I hadn't named yet. He was managing us. I found this both infuriating and, in my quieter moments, deeply funny. I told him so one morning in the barn, just the two of us, pitching hay. I said, "I notice you've been making yourself scarce in the evenings." He kept his eyes on the hay. He said, "I've been tired." I said, "You've been tired in the kitchen, every evening, since about the 3rd week of November." He said, "Sometimes a man gets tired." I said, "Davy." He stopped. He leaned on the pitchfork and looked at me with our mother's eyes, direct and not apologetic. He said, "I just want things to work out, that's all." I said, "Things will work out how they work out. You can't push a river." He said, "I know. I'm not pushing. I'm here while it moves." I looked at him. I thought about the night he'd come home and told me about a woman on the depot platform in the rain, and the look on his face when he'd said he'd invited her to stay, the trouble in his eyes when he'd understood he'd overstepped, and the certainty underneath that trouble, that it had still been the right thing to do. I thought about what it had taken, in a 14-year-old boy, to step forward like that without permission, and without a plan. Not rashness. I knew what rashness looked like in Davy, and it wasn't that. It was something else. I said, "You did right," when you asked her. He looked at the floor. I said, "Your mother would have done the same thing. She never once left a person standing in the rain." He looked up, and I could see he'd needed to hear that, and I wished I'd said it sooner. I said, "I know you know that." He did. He went back to the hay. I went back to mine. That was all either of us needed. February was the long month. It always is in that country. The cold doesn't relent. The days are gray and short. The work is repetitive and cold-handed, and the only answer is to keep going because stopping is worse. Vera's letters had produced results. 3 school boards had responded, 2 in the Southern District and 1 in Dry Fork, which was 40 miles east and too far. She showed them to me without preamble one evening, and I read them and said they looked like solid situations. She said yes. I said, "What do you think?" She said, I think I'm less anxious to leave than I was in November. I said, all right. She said, that's not nothing, Rafe. I said, I know it isn't. We were at the table. The lamp was between us, her hands flat on the oilcloth, and she was looking at me with the steadiness she always brought to things. I put down the letters. I looked back. I said, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm asking it because I mean it, not because the room needs filling, or because it's the convenient thing. She said, all right. I said, I want you to stay, as my wife, if you're willing, because this house is better with you in it, and Davy is better, and I am better, and I have not been better in a very long time, and I did not know I wasn't until you were here. She was quiet. She looked at me without moving, taking the measure of it. She said, you're a closed-off man. I said, yes. She said, you manage everything yourself, and you don't ask for help, and you hold what you feel at a considerable distance from anything you'd call a conversation. I said, that's accurate. She said, I am not interested in being a thing you manage. I said, I know that. I'm not asking you to be. She said, then what are you asking? I said, I'm asking you to be the other person in this house who decides things. I'm asking you to be someone Davy can count on, and someone I can count on in return. And I'd like to try being someone you can count on too, if you'll let me work at it. I'm not asking you to need me. I'm asking you to choose me, and I'll spend whatever time we have making it a choice you don't regret. She was still looking at me. The fire was going, and the wind was in the pines, and Davy was in his room, supposedly asleep, which I did not believe for a moment. She said, that is the most words you've said to me in a single sitting since October. I said, I'm aware of that. She said, I notice you didn't say you love me. I said, I'm working up to it. She held my eyes for another moment. Then the full smile, not the corner one, the real one, the one that takes its time and stays when it arrives. And she said, all right, Rafe Dolan, I'll give you the chance. That was February. March came in soft. Falk called Vera to his office on the first Thursday of the month. She came back tight-lipped and said the position was still filled, said nothing else. But something had changed, because 2 weeks later, he called her back and offered a position as Flat Creek School's second teacher, starting in September, funded through a district consolidation he'd managed to arrange. She came home and told us at supper, and Davy dropped his fork and let out a sound that was half shout and half something else entirely. And she laughed, the good laugh, and put her hand on his shoulder, and he sat there with the look of a person who has gotten exactly what he'd hoped for and is working out what to do with the feeling. After supper, she asked me if I'd done something. I said Falk did what the pressure told him. She said, Rafe. I said, I may have mentioned the consolidation option to him. He found the idea himself. She was quiet. Then she said, I told you I handle my own circumstances. I said, you did. And I heard you. You'd handled it as far as it could go alone, and then a second set of hands moved it the rest of the way. And that is still you handling it. It's just you knowing what help to take and from who. She looked at me for a moment. She said, that is an extremely convenient position. I said, it's the one I've got. She said, you are an exasperating man. I said, yes. She said, stop looking satisfied about it. I tried. I don't think I managed it. We were married in April, on the grass at the east side of the house where the ground was dry and the new green was coming up in the pasture beyond the fence. The preacher from Millhaven came to do it, because Flat Creek's church was between ministers, and Pruill was not there. I had not invited him, but most of the rest of the district came out, because word moves fast in a small place, and the general feeling was that it was about time, which told me the town's assessment of things had shifted faster than I'd expected. Davy stood next to me through the whole ceremony, with the look of a person who has pulled off something considerable, and is being very disciplined about not showing it. Nettie came from Millhaven, with her husband Cobb, and her baby girl, who was 3 months old, and slept through the whole thing in Nettie's arms. When it was done, Nettie held both of Vera's hands and said something quiet I didn't catch, and Vera said something back, and they were both steady-eyed about it, which I was grateful for because I was having enough trouble keeping my own face in order and couldn't have managed 2 women weeping on top of it. We rode home in the spring afternoon, the three of us, Davy and Vera and me, and the hills were green, and the creek was running clear, and the horses were easy under us. Davy was ahead on the road, and Vera was beside me, and the afternoon light was long and yellow, and the ranch came into sight around the last bend, looking the way a place looks when you've been away from it, and come back, and it still belongs to you, only more so. Davy went ahead to the barn. Vera and I stood at the gate for a moment, looking at the house. Her hand was in mine. She said, "This is a good place." I said, "It's yours now." She looked at me. She said, "Ours." I said, "Ours." We stood there a while. The afternoon was warm, and the light was going gold on the hill behind the barn, and in the near paddock, the gray gelding, the one I'd never gotten around to selling after Pruill bought him, and then returned him as unsatisfactory, which suited me fine, was moving slow along the fence, easy and unhurried, the way a horse moves when it knows exactly where it belongs. I have thought about that day often since, about what it cost and what it took, and how long the road there was. About the years I spent grinding along the hard margins of things, keeping Nettie and Davy fed, keeping myself together enough to be what they needed. About the morning I walked out of the last of that life, and bought the 40 acres, and told myself the hard part was done. About how wrong I was, and how right, at the same time. The hard part and the good part are not always different things. Sometimes the ground you've cleared by the hardest work turns out to be the ground the best things grow in, and you couldn't have known that ahead of time. You can only know it standing on the other side, looking back. It was Davy who knew first. It's always the ones who've had to read the room since they were small who know first, who recognize warmth faster than the rest of us, because they learned early it wasn't guaranteed. He stood on that platform in the rain, and he saw a woman calculating what to do next, with a composure he recognized because he'd practiced it himself, and he knew, the way some people simply know things, that the calculation, and the ranch, and his brother's buried heart were all pointing at the same answer. And he did something about it before I thought to, which is not how I'd have written the story if it had been mine to write. But it wasn't mine to write. It was his, that part. He was 14, and he'd already figured out the most important thing I would figure out that year, and I am not too proud to say that plainly. The summer was good. Vera taught Davy through it, which she'd decided on her own, without asking whether I thought it was appropriate. And I did think it was appropriate, and would have said so if asked. She had him ready for the county examination by August, and he sat it and passed it with a score that made her proud in the quiet, unsentimental way she was proud of things. She noted it in her ledger and said, "There," and moved on to the next task. I told him separately how well he'd done, in the barn, just the two of us. The way I'd told him things all his life when I wanted them to land without ceremony. He nodded. He said he was going to read the history she'd left him. He went off toward the house, and I leaned against the stall for a moment in the quiet, and thought about what it is to have done the right thing, slowly, by accident, through stubbornness and the impulsive good sense of a 14-year-old boy. We had a letter from Nettie in August. She said the baby was walking. She said she'd be in Flat Creek in September for Vera's first week at the school, because she wasn't going to miss it. She said to tell Davy she was proud of him. And she said to tell Rafe it was about time. I wrote back, yes, it was. Fall came in its own way. The way fall comes in that valley. The light changing first, going amber and long. The mornings sharp with the first cold. The horses grew their winter coats, and the work shifted its shape, the way seasonal work does. And the three of us settled into the new arrangement so completely that the arrangement itself stopped being a thing I noticed, and became instead just the texture of the days, which is the best thing that can happen to a good arrangement. Vera's school started on the third Monday of September. She was up before the light that morning, which was not unusual for her, and when I came into the kitchen, she was at the window with her coffee, and I could see she was lit up in some way, not nervous, nothing that uncertain, but the way a person gets before a thing they've worked toward for a long time and are finally about to have. I poured my coffee and stood beside her. I said, "You'll be fine." She said, "I know." I said, "Those children are going to get a good teacher." She looked at me over her cup with something that might have been exasperation, and was definitely also something else. She said, "Rafe." I said, "Yes." She said, Thank you. For all of it. I thought about what to say. I thought about the depot platform and the rain, and a 14-year-old boy's impulsive act of welcome. I thought about the kitchen in October, and the way she'd taken in the yard. Practical, unafraid. I thought about December snow, and the argument about Davy, and the full laugh in a warm kitchen. I thought about February, and what it had taken me to say in one sitting what I'd spent my whole adult life not saying to anyone, and what it had felt like when she said, "All right." I said, "Thank Davy, he got there first." She said, "I intend to, but I'm thanking you too." I said, "All right." She drank her coffee. The light came up gold over the east hill, slow and warm, the way September light comes. Outside, the barn door banged. Davy, up and at his chores without being told, which had become in the course of a year simply part of how the morning ran. I listened to him moving in the barn, and I thought about what you work for. All of it. Not the land or the horses or even the squared accounts, but this. The ordinary morning, the coffee going, the sound of someone you love getting on with the day. Vera set her cup down. She straightened her coat, checked her hair, picked up the satchel she'd packed the night before. She turned at the door. I said, "Go teach them something." She said, "I will." She went out into the September morning, and I watched her go, her steps steady and purposeful on the path toward the road, and the light caught her, and the day opened up around her, the way days do when you've done the hard things right, and the good things are finally simply yours. That's how it happened. I have told it straight, and I have left out the parts that were only mine to know. And what's left is this. A boy with his mother's eyes who did not leave a stranger standing in the rain, and a woman who came to a ranch with one trunk and nowhere to go, and turned out to be the person the place had been missing, and a man who took longer than he should have to say what he knew from the beginning. Everything else was just us living it, and that, for a man who had organized his life around what needed doing, turned out to be the best kind of work there was. I should say something about Nettie, because Nettie is part of how this went. She came in late September, true to her word. Her husband Cobb drove the wagon from Millhaven with the baby in a basket between them, and she was in the yard before I had the gate open, already talking to Vera the way she talked to everyone, with the particular kind of frankness that had gotten her in trouble all her life, and had never slowed her down once. She had our mother's directness, and none of my habit of holding it back, and within the first hour she had told Vera exactly what she thought of the kitchen organization, which was high praise, and exactly what she thought of my habit of going to bed at 8, which was not. I watched them together that first afternoon. Nettie was 21 and had a baby on her hip, and all of her mother's warmth in the way she moved through a room, and Vera was 30 and had 6 years of a careful life behind her, and all of the steadiness that comes from handling your own circumstances without flinching, and they were, the two of them, entirely at ease from the first hour. That told me something. Nettie was not easy to fool, and was not inclined to pretend. If she'd seen something wrong, she'd have told me. What she told me, on the second day, when we were alone for a moment in the barn while Cobb was helping Davy with the horses, was, "She's good, Rafe." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you? Because you have a way of knowing things, and then continuing to act like you're not sure." I said, "I asked her to marry me." Nettie looked at me. I said, "She said yes." Nettie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "About time," and punched me in the shoulder, which was how she'd always expressed affection, and went back inside to find the baby. She stayed 3 days, and for 3 days the house was a different size than it usually was. Fuller, noisier, more life moving through it. I went to bed at 8 the first night, just to give Nettie the satisfaction of being right about it, and the second night, I stayed up to 10, and the third, we were all at the table until nearly 11, Davy showing off what he'd learned, and Cobb listening with genuine interest, and the baby asleep on the settle, and Nettie and Vera talking about the school, about the children who'd shown up in September, about the boy who could already cipher, and the girl who had the makings of a reader. Vera talked about her school the way I talked about the horses, with specific regard, the particular details that tell you a person knows what they're looking at and cares about what they find. When Cobb and Nettie left for Millhaven on the 4th morning, Nettie held Vera's hands at the wagon and said, "Come see us in November. Bring these two." Vera said she would. Nettie looked at me over Vera's shoulder and gave me the look she'd given me all our lives when she thought I was getting something right. I got in the wagon to help lift the baby's basket and pretended I hadn't seen it. We went to Millhaven in November, all three of us. It was the first time I'd been away from the ranch for more than a Thursday in years, and the strangeness of it was good. The strangeness of sitting at Nettie's table with Cobb and the baby and Vera, all of us in the same room, a family of a shape I hadn't known how to imagine for myself. Davy fell asleep on the settle at 9, and Cobb and I went out to check the horses and came back to find Nettie and Vera still talking, the lamps low, the baby between them in the basket again, and I stood in the doorway for a moment and thought, this is what it looks like. This is the thing I was working toward all those years I thought I was only keeping people from starving. Cobb put a hand on my shoulder as he went past me into the room, the way a good-natured man does when he's seen something and doesn't want to embarrass you by naming it. I went in. I sat down. The night was good. Winter came back in December and we were ready for it. The second winter with Vera in the house was different from the first, in the way that the first time you do something is always different from the second. The first time is the accounting, the taking stock, the finding out. The second time you know what you're doing, and you can put your attention elsewhere. She knew the horses by name by then, and she knew the ones that needed watching, and she knew the particular sound the barn roof made when the weight of snow was getting toward the upper limit, and I knew that she kept one candle in the window on very cold nights, not for any practical reason, but out of some habit of welcome, and that she was always awake if I came in late, and always had something on the stove, and that she slept lightly and read until she was certain she was going to sleep. And sometimes I'd find the book face down on the coverlet, and the lamp still burning, and I'd blow it out, and it was good. It was a very ordinary good thing, the kind that accumulates. The school was going well. She told me about it in the evenings, and I listened the way I'd watched her listen to Davy, fully, without looking for somewhere else to be. She had 17 children in September, 22 by January, when the families on the east edge of the district decided the road wasn't too bad. She had a girl named Pearl who could already multiply and was bored, and Vera had started giving her harder problems from her own materials, which was exactly what the committee in Copper Wells had said was overreach, and what Vera had decided, without drama, was just teaching. She had a boy named Amos who couldn't sit still, and she'd figured out that if he had something to hold in his hands he could concentrate, and she'd started giving him a smooth stone to keep in his pocket during lessons, and it was working. She told me these things, and I thought about the careful attention required to know a child that well, in that short a time, and I thought about the committee in Copper Wells and what they'd missed. I told her that one evening. I told her what I thought they'd missed, not the arithmetic, but the particular attention, the willingness to find out how a mind was working and adjust. I said, the man they chose for the Flat Creek post. He lasted until February. She looked up. I said, Falk replaced him with a retired schoolmaster from the Eastern District. Retired again in March. You'd already been at the school 2 months before Falk found a replacement. I heard it from the ranchers. She said, you didn't tell me this. I said, it wasn't my news to bring. She was quiet. Then she said, you knew and you didn't use it. I said, it wasn't mine to use. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, who are you? I said, Rafe Dolan. I run horses. We've met. She said, you are a more complicated man than you let on. I said, I have been told. She said, by who? I said, by everyone who's ever waited long enough to find out. She looked back at her book, but she was smiling, and I could see it from where I was, and I considered that a considerable achievement for a Tuesday evening in January. Spring came the way spring comes in that valley, sudden and excessive, as if it had been held back by a gate, and someone finally opened it. The creek ran high, and the mud was everywhere, and the horses were restless, and Davy was outside from first light, which suited both of us. Vera planted a kitchen garden in April in the space along the south wall that had been weeds since I bought the place, which I helped her clear on a Saturday morning without being asked, and by June, there were beans and squash coming in, and she made something from them that I could not have named but ate 3 helpings of. Pruell came by in May, on a horse-buying errand. He was civil this time, more than civil actually, a deliberate civility that cost him something, and he was aware of it. He said Miss, he corrected himself. Mrs. Dolan. He looked at me when he said it, and I held his eyes, and didn't say anything, and that was the end of the boarding house remark, permanently. Vera did not comment on it afterward. She didn't need to. Some things are already said when they're simply over. By the end of that first full year, I had stopped being able to clearly remember what the house had been like before October, which I took as a sign of something. Not that I'd forgotten, I hadn't, and I didn't want to, because the before was part of the after, in the way that all the hard years are part of what comes next. But I could no longer feel the weight of what was missing, because it wasn't missing anymore. Davy turned 15 in August, and was growing so fast that he needed new boots twice in 1 year, which he thought was a character flaw, and Vera thought was fine evidence of a healthy young man. And she told him so, and he looked embarrassed in the way 15-year-olds look embarrassed by kindness from people they love. He was reading on his own by then, not assigned reading, his own choices, things Vera had pointed him toward, and things he'd found himself in the collection she'd brought from Copper Wells and arranged on the shelf in the sitting room, which had previously held nothing but my accounting books and a set of tools that had no other home. That shelf told you something about the year. Before it was tools and numbers. After, it was books and tools and numbers, and sometimes a stone Davy had pocketed from the creek, and Vera's marking pen left out next to the ledger she used for school, and a letter from Nettie half read, and the baby's drawing of a horse that Cobb had sent because the baby had announced the horse was for Uncle Rafe. All of it on the same shelf, all of it belonging. I looked at that shelf one evening in September, the first anniversary of the day she'd come through the gate, and I thought about the man I'd been the morning she arrived, contained and organized, and not precisely unhappy, but stripped of everything that wasn't necessary, having long since decided that necessity was the same as sufficiency. I thought about the morning I'd told her it was Davy's offer, not mine, and how small that had been, and how little it had mattered, because she was not a woman who was defined by the first thing anyone said to her. She came in from the bedroom, where she'd been writing a letter to a colleague in the Southern District about their reading curricula, and saw me looking at the shelf, and she came and stood beside me and looked at it too. She said, "What are you thinking?" I said, "I'm thinking I was a fool for the first month." She said, "Which month?" I said, "You know which month." She said, "You were not a fool. You were a man who didn't know what to do with something he hadn't planned for." I said, "That is a very charitable construction." She said, "I'm a teacher. It's part of the work." I said, "I am not one of your students." She said, "No, you're considerably harder, but the principle applies." I looked at her. She was looking at the shelf with the expression she had when she was content, not performing contentment. Actually it. The lamp was behind us, and the light was warm, and the evening was quiet, and the horses were settled in the barn, and Davy was somewhere with a book. I said, "I love you." She looked up. I said, "I told you I was working up to it." In February. She said, "That was 7 months ago." I said I was working up to it. And I didn't say how long that would take. She looked at me for a moment, with an expression I'd learned over the year, the one that meant she found me exasperating, and was not going to say so, because she'd already said it enough times. Then she put her head against my shoulder, which was not a thing she did often, being not given to easy demonstrations, and so it meant more when she did. She said, "I know, Rafe. I've known for a while." I said, "I could have said it sooner." She said, "You said it now. That's enough." We stood there in the lamplight and looked at the shelf that was full of the year, and outside the evening settled and the horses were easy, and somewhere in the house Davy turned a page, and I thought, this is what you build toward, when you build toward anything. Not the end of the hard years. Not the cleared ground, the thing that grows in it, after. That is the whole of the story. Everything else has just been us living it, and that has been, for a man who spent a long time believing living was beside the point of working, the best surprise of a life that needed one.